You're live.
Okay, so we'll call the meeting to order. The approval of the agenda and order of business. I have no changes.
So there were
Oh,
two, I'm sorry, yeah,
I'd like to have one. I just like to add, I guess council had a discussion about financial aid for Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the discussion should be more around helping the refugees, I think, than anything.
and probably should have a discussion about using remote participation by council and council members in council meetings. May need a procedure going forward if you're interested in that. And don't forget the personnel matter in closed session in addition to the land matter.
And on the Ukraine issue, Andrea sent an email about the flag.
We had to order. We hope to have it for Friday.
Should we even do a motion or something on that one? Talk to Ukraine, maybe.
Well,
Just
we can't put it up if council doesn't want us to, that's for sure.
no, but what I'm saying, I think it's important to let people know we're planning to do that.
Okay.
It would be good to have a motion.
Anything else?
No, I'll move to approve the agenda as amended.
Okay, second that motion. Discussion, all those in favor? Opposed, motion's carried. I'm unaware of any public input.
No, there isn't any.
Minutes of the previous meeting, any errors or omissions there? Gary, you want to move they be approved?
I will.
Second.
Discussion, all those in favor?
I think I'll
Motion's
get
carried.
around to their reputation.
It does.
Yeah. Public presentations, I'm not aware of any of those. Okay, I hate to think that we're on to 8.1, but we are. Community development, recreation, public washrooms.
A little bit of time this morning to talk about bodies. And I get to be the lucky one to have that conversation with you. So essentially what we're looking for is, in previous years, council has provided some direction and some budget to install some porta potties at various locations around the municipality. And so there's been some questions around what is the appropriate number of porta potties and location. So I just wanted to bring back the plan for what we have suggested. And if council has any input on changes for that, then we'd be happy to have that conversation today. So there are 8 different locations that we're suggesting. And those would include some of the locations that have previously been identified. So that would include Lordley Park and the Lordley Park porta potty. Because we organized the Picnic in the Park event that we typically in the past have asked for a donation of that porta potty. And the company, if we end up using the same company this year, they have been very gracious to provide that in previous years. So I will be making that same request, but that's an important location. The Crossroad Playground, Chester Basin, the Tank Cook Ferry Wharf, the Cams parking lot. So that serves, that was initially a request from the Chester District Soccer Association. They had always in the past, it actually would apply for us for a grant. We give them the grant and then they would
Put in the porta potty.
for it. So instead of giving them a grant, it's just one of those ones that we felt that was really important just because of the volume of kids that are, of course, in the soccer program. And it also gets used by families going to the playgrounds, people walking the track, skateboarding. So it's an important location. Chester train station, Waterrose Park. And of course, the Waterrose Park, typically in the past, we've had a washroom facility there, but since the washroom has been closed and the planned renovation to it, the idea was to continue to have one there this summer until that renovation is completed. New Ross, and so if you recall the New Ross location, we had some conversation with council in the fall around that one and determined that we would there's some interest in putting one in the fall, but it was late in the season, there was some issues with availability, so we thought that we would just postpone that, putting that one there.
That's at the entrance to that trail system.
And that will be located at the, yeah, the head of the trail system. And then the East River Trail parking lot. East River Trail parking lot, of course, is planned to have an eco-loo at that location, but until that time, we felt that was an important location just because of the volume of people that are going in there, of course, to Castle Rock. So those are the locations that we had identified for this year. And so there's a little bit more information in there, both on the Walnut Rose Park washroom renovation, because just to give it a little context to public washrooms. So we, of course, we got that grant last year to complete that renovation. And we've been working with Ellen, our accessibility coordinator, to help provide some input to make sure that we're providing an accessible washroom there, in addition to being an important public option at that park. And so that is in the, that's going to, you're seeing that in the capital budget. So that is planned to proceed this summer. And then the last piece, just in connection with public washrooms, is our public open space and our open space plan. And so we've had several locations identified for those eco-loos and there's environmental toilets. So again, that plan is being implemented this summer. The locations that have been identified in there, we do plan to follow through, issue an RFP this summer, and follow through with the installation of those eco-loos. So we just want to give a little bit of that context as part of your decision making on the portable toilet. So the only other piece to this is of course the budget, and so you can see the outline. So it's essentially around $1,000 per toilet for the season, and so that includes the delivery and pickup, as well as making cleanings and maintenance and all that stuff. So so I guess I'll open it up.
Anybody have an issue
questions
with
or
what
suggestions?
goes back in?
I
It is-
don't, but it's, I mean, environmental, is this like phase one? Like,
Again, it depends on our funding.
but I know, but that's not the entire list. This is like phase one is my question, I guess.
No, that's the list that we have so far. It can be, we could revisit that at some point.
Well, I had one on for Foxwood Beach area, which was on the list of Richardson, it's not here.
Okay.
That's why I'm asking the question.
Yes, Andre?
Yeah, so I recall when we did the decision, there was many properties listed, I think. And I agree, I thought that this was, we were gonna do this as our first phase, and then we were gonna, maybe at some future time, we were gonna maybe revisit those other properties. That was my recollection of this.
Mine too, and I know that I had the Foxwood Beach area on this.
Okay, I'll retract that statement and I'll say, yes, this is phase one. And we will, once we get through phase one, because there is a limit to how many we can probably do in the course of the summer. So we'll see how we make out, see what we get back from the RFP. And then we can come back and revisit and talk to council and see what are our kind of phase two locations.
Yeah, because it's not a big deal to me, but I mean, at some point, you might as well do it in the playground of the basin as opposed to keep putting porta potty there.
Well, actually, Fox Point Beach isn't on this list of porta potty locations, but should one be there? Because I mean,
Yes,
I know, I took scuba training last fall, and
a lot of usage on the beach.
when you have to go, everybody's going across the road, and it's a bad situation there. Like, it seems like we may want to consider adding a porta
It's a
potty.
heavy used area. I argued that before we were putting it in. I was surprised. That's why I asked if it was phase one, because.
Yeah, so that may have just gotten missed on the list. So would you like that added to both lists, porta potties for this year, as well as the future eco toilet location?
As long as it
I can
doesn't,
remember the old toilet locations that were identified, it might have been already on the.
I don't remember.
I'll go back and revisit that list. Yeah, I can for sure.
But
It wasn't on the eco
It was-
toilet list.
it was on the environmental toilet list.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, but it should have a porta potty now.
Well, yeah, people are going in the woods there all summer. There's no question.
It's bad.
And it was in a bad situation as it is now because there's more people and there's divers use it regularly.
Every weekend.
Yeah, fall and spring, so it's a heavily used area with no bathroom facility.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tina?
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say that it's already been said that, but my recollection is that that would be just phase one, that there are other areas that have been identified for the Enviro toilets. So I'm just repeating others now, but I had my hand up just for a few minutes. So I just wanted to get on record to say that, yeah, I absolutely agree with Floyd and Andre in terms of this being first phase. Yeah, thanks.
Okay,
Chad, I wonder, is there any landowner issues with locating any of these other spots? Like I noticed ones we have are either public property or the nonprofits own it and they want it, that kind of.
Yeah, so not that I'm aware of at this current time, but we'll absolutely take that into consideration. We mostly try to identify municipal land for locations, but some we have, like for the school, we always check in with the school and get permission before locating there. So yeah, any of those other locations, we would definitely do that before locating there.
okay, so we want to revisit.
I just want to question, so the porta potties, are they clean like once a week from staff?
The company does that. They get pumped and cleaned once a week.
Once a week?
Yes.
Okay, great, because if not.
Yeah. And so we will, so we'll have this conversation next year again. And so even perhaps some of the existing location for porta potties could
May
transition
switch to the
into permanent.
As it just said monthly service, so I didn't know, it wasn't clear.
Yeah. So
Okay.
that does.
So today, Chad, is it the porta potty locations that we need to have
A
confirmed by
motion to
council?
approve.
That's right. And then in capital budget, I think you'll see those 3 Enviro toilets for
And then maybe
this,
4.
for this budget year. And you can add you can add additional ones for this year and you'll get some feedback from staff. And you can also add them for future years,
Yeah.
additional phases.
Okay, somebody prepared to move that we approve the porta potties for this year?
Yeah, with the addition of the faucet.
Is that gonna be with the addition of the faucet line?
Well, we can put a porta potty, well, yeah, because it'll take that way longer than that in order to, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what it should be.
Okay, that's a motion,
I'll second it.
discussion, all those in favor, opposed, motion's carried. Thank you. Traffic study.
I'm just admitting it was a meeting.
You can go on.
This little manual is joining us, I'll just provide a brief introduction to the manual and the project, and then I'll turn it over to him.
He should be on, he's just got his camera and his mic.
Okay.
Morning, Manuel. So this is Manuel Nicolescu from CBCL. So just to recall for council, we retained CBCL last year to study, analyze, and provide recommendations on ways to improve parking, traffic flow in the village of Chester, and also attending to a portion of coverage as well, with particular attention to circulation and safety for all users. So all users in this case include vehicles, pedestrians, cyclists as well. And then specifically look at the impact of one-way street closures, prioritization for winter maintenance, and temporary or permanent street closures as well, with some attention to a sidewalk cafe initiative. So Emmanuel is going to walk you through his report and the recommendations that CBCL have made to us. I expect that you're going to hear a few intriguing ideas. The staff is really willing to follow up on your behalf with either further information or implementation as well. So let us know what catches your attention. And other than that, I'll pass it over to you, Emmanuel. Take it away.
Thank you.
Morning.
Good morning, everyone. Councilors, Mayor, thank you for having me. And thank you for the opportunity to work with you on this project. Can you all hear me all right?
Yeah.
Good, all right. Can everybody see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
There you go.
What was that? Sorry.
They read it as well, Emmanuel.
Okay, thank you. So on the agenda with this presentation, I'll be walking you through what we did, the scope of the project, what we found out, what we heard from communities, and some options for your consideration. to then go through any questions you might have on the report or the presentation. So first of all, the study areas. The project was split into two foci, one on the village of Chester, the second in Hubbard's on Fox Point Road, Front Road. There were really four or five major foci for the study. As Gordon indicated, number one was to address perceived parking issues, trying to improve the parking conditions, primarily in the village of Chester. Two, in terms of circulation, investigate the potential conversions of one-way road conversions within the village, as well as Fox Point Front Road. Investigate then traffic calming measures and strategies that may be put in place. Review options for increased prioritization, of snow clearing on some of the village roads. And then lastly, review the sidewalk cafe initiative. So we did, obviously not all of those components apply to both study areas, but we'll go with through them in order. First things first, we were able to set up an interactive consultation site on the municipalities. Actually, it isn't Social Pinpoint. It's your very own platform. I apologize for that. It included a series of interactive maps presenting, first of all, the study and the project to participants and inviting them to provide inputs and drag points of interest or any kind of issues they might have. And it also included a number of surveys that were administered to the respondents. Our partners, FBM, in this case, assisted us with the stakeholder engagement, as well as running a number of, or participating in some of the live events in the village. That culminated in an open house over the summer, late summer, I believe, when we presented our findings to date and received some more very good input from participants. The original, or one of the initial, the names of the project included the traffic study and improvement. And I'm an urban planner by training, having really focused and specialized in transportation planning. And what do transportation planners and engineers do? Well, they count cars. So first off, that's what we did. We first of all reviewed turning counts and volumes that were provided by Public Works. And I believe these counts were undertaken in June 2020. And this is what you see over a day and a weekend. And these are peak hour volumes on those roads, and that's bi-directional. 2020, what we saw was that really on village roads, we're in the 200 to 270 vehicles per hour on Duke Street. Not so different than the weekends. All right, well, that was 2020. So really the beginning in the heart of the pandemic. So we did new counts in 2021 to see how they compare. We did two sets of counts, one in June and then again in August during Race Week, to compare just what the differences in travel demands were. And we did one last count then in September to sort of try to get confirmation on what our typical demand profile is. I'm saying demand profiles, by nature, Chester attracts a lot of activity during the summer season. So what we see are two main demand profiles. We have the sort of typical demand off-season, characterized by residents moving around, going about their daily business, commuting. And then we have the summer months, particularly around Chester's Race Week, when we have an influx of tourists and as well as summer residents. Those will have different patterns and obviously different volumes involved. What we saw in 2021 within the village, volumes were quite similar to what we saw in 2020. So we're pushing up to 200, 270 on Luke Street, 500, 400, 700 on Highway 3, depending on where we count. Similarly, in Hubbard's, we're about 400, 450 on Highway 3, 250 or so on 239, and then about 80 to 100, 150 sometimes on Front Road, and that's where we see these volumes. What does this mean in terms of the scale of vehicular traffic? It's not that high. These roads are designed to carry well above that volume. So strictly speaking, from a road capacity standpoint, there isn't really an issue. Roads can handle these volumes comfortably, and we'll get into an analysis of that. In August, what we find, obviously volumes go up by 100 or more on some of the village streets, about 100 or so, 100 to 200 on Highway 3. That's partly just regional travel, regional tourist and leisure travel, as well as very specific race week. The count in August was undertaken really in the middle of race week. So we managed to capture that peak. When we look now at September, one summer is done. So this is in September 2021. A lot of the restrictions had been lifted. So it was really before the sort of the Omicron variant came and return of restrictions. When we see the volumes on Highway 3, about 400, 450, 600, 650. So we're in line with what we had counted in June. And this count was done right before the end of school, at the end of June. What does that mean? Well, we took down those volumes and we did an analysis, multimodal transportation assessment that reviewed intersection capacity conditions for vehicular traffic, as well as pedestrians and cyclists. In our counts, there are very few of the latter. So in terms of a quantitative analysis of levels of service for pedestrians and cyclists, they're quite good. It's more on the qualitative side. In terms of the traffic analysis, in our report, we delved a bit into the targeted results, but this is everything in a nutshell. As we counted them, everything was quite good, no capacity issues. So we did a sensitivity analysis. So the traffic that we counted, plus 30%, plus 50%, even doubling to see what would happen. The reason for that is there were uncertainties about what the actual demand profile is in 2020 and 2021. These are the most recent counts that we have for these study areas. And we just weren't sure what the COVID impact is or would be in other years, so pre-2019. From our own views and analysis and what we've heard from other jurisdictions, about 30% is the adjustment we might have added. So in some cases, in 2021, vehicular demand on the road was about 30% lower than pre-pandemic levels. In other cases, particularly on the weekends, they were quite close to pre-pandemic, so not much change. Be that as it may, we did the sensitivity analysis to see just what would happen if these volumes were higher. What we found is really it's only when we're doubling the volume, particularly at Highway 3 and Duke Street, as well as on Foxman Road, that we actually started seeing some capacity constraints. So again, a doubling of the volumes we counted in June. When looking at August, well, August is a little bit different. During race week, we're quite approaching capacities on some movements, really the outbound movements out of Duke Street. And obviously, as we double or increase by 50%, that's when we're at capacity. We might see the need for improvement. So summarizing all of that, really we're only getting into what we call level service F, which means we're really at capacity and delays are significant. That we're seeing that happen really only on Duke Street at Highway 3, and those would be the northbound movements and the southbound movements. So really onto Highway 3. That's where we're seeing those problems. That's an intersection that really has only stop control on the minor approaches. So Highway 3 is free flow, and it's really aren't that many necessarily gap opportunities when we're doubling volumes. To test that even further, we carried out a warrant analysis, a signal warrant analysis, to see from from the Department of Public Works perspective, if the volumes measured or recorded at this intersection would warrant signalization. Really, it's only when we're doubling volumes that we get into that being warranted. So there's not a lot of chance of that happening with volumes such as they are. However, we do approach those conditions during race week. So what this tells us is that really, surprisingly, the summer peak and around race week, that's really the outlier, and that's when conditions are special and a bit different. Now, added to that analysis, we look at safety. So what's the track record in terms of collisions involving vehicles and non-vehicles? First of all, in Chester, and then on Fox Point Road. Not that many over the last 5 years. Total of 24 as reported by the RCMP. Now the fire department did have additional collisions, particularly in the center there, on Central Street, actually, that would add to this. The picture we're seeing in terms of kinds of collisions, nothing really stood out. There aren't really any significant design features or any kind of issues that pop out. We see in yellow there hitting a parked vehicle. So in terms wherever cars are parked on the road, or sometimes off-road, it happens that there might be a bit of friction and cars are dinged. Particularly on the grocery store's parking lot, we see a lot of hit and runs. Again, that's just regular friction. Hitting another moving vehicle on Highway 3, particularly east of Duke Street there. There are a lot of driveways, there are the residences there. So that's friction. So what we're seeing is generally a lot of movement in and out of driveways. People might be not always careful, and there are some accidents. Showing that information again in various ways in terms of injuries, fatalities. Really, there was only one, I believe, severe injury in Chester over the last 5 years. Otherwise, mostly it's just property damage. So the vehicles, the kind of hits or collisions, hitting a parked car, hitting another moving vehicles. Again, those are the big conditions. Weather doesn't explain it, neither does surface conditions. So these occurred dry weather with lighting conditions, so nothing really explaining that. Similarly, in Hubbards, not that many, so some sporadic collisions here and there on 329 particularly. Nothing really came out on the front road itself. However, just because accidents haven't been reported or haven't been recorded in the last 5 years, the RCMP record unfortunately ends at that. They don't keep anything beyond 5 years. Conditions during race week are such that there's a lot of friction on some of the village roads, which are prone to perhaps increased likelihood of collision and particularly obstruction to emergency vehicles. So this was driving through. There was another fellow coming down with a truck carrying a boat, and we met, said hello, and negotiated a way through. However, it's not necessarily easy in an emergency situation, be it fire or an ambulance getting through in that condition will be tricky. So that again tells us when there's an issue that needs to be. That takes us then into traffic calming. Some of the causes of the incident that we reviewed included possibly speeding or driving inappropriately on some of the north-south streets in Chester. Hilly terrain and driving at relative speed on some of those roads intersections can be inadvisable. So how to address that? Well, we look at traffic calming. Traffic calming through design, introducing some kind of element in the streetscape that naturally then will reduce speeds or bring an awareness to primarily drivers, but all road users that extra care is warranted. And in this respect, there are quite a lot of measures that can be brought to bear. And we had discussed them with the Department of Public Works. At the time, they were in the process of drafting traffic calming policy. That's still in the works, as far as we understood from them, hasn't been finalized. But that policy is looking at a wide range of, again, these interventions and when they might be suitable. And really the most critical point from Public Works point of view is that they not interfere with snow clearing and emergency vehicle access, particularly as the majority of these roads are still within the jurisdiction of Public Works, not the municipalities' roads. Now, the department might be receptive to, as we show here, selective narrowings of the road or bump outs, potentially elevated crosswalks, particularly where there are already stop signs. What they aren't really very receptive to is using stop controls to slow vehicles down. So by virtue of the way the village's roads were designed, north-south roads are typically free flow, or stop control only at alternating cross streets, and it's east-west streets that have a stop sign usually. What that means is that obviously the north-south road to Highway 3 are generally free flow, or they accommodate speeding. We'll get into what recommendations out of this are, but really what the department would like to see before anything is actually done in terms of design is confirmation, first of all, that there is a speeding issue. So we'll get into how that's done. But really the idea is to conduct a speed survey and really confirm on which streets and at which location speeding is a concern before introducing traffic calming. In terms of circulation, we also reviewed all the very different kinds of active transportation facilities available in terms of design and in terms of ability to the road network. And these are typically considered or chosen based on a number of criteria, mostly road design criteria, but user comfort as well, the types of users that would use them, the aesthetics, and of course then into the actual implementation costs and maintenance and so on. This all works together with the traffic calming, and we brought in circulation analysis because they can't just be considered in separate. Along with that then, in terms of street prioritization, so we were asked what can be done to identify really which streets within Chester, village of Chester, could be brought up to class, to a level 2. So right now, all streets in Chester are considered level 3, and they're really only cleared 24 hours at best. So obviously that causes some difficulties and some concern, particularly with regards to emergency vehicle access. During a snowstorm, as you all were aware, if a vehicle needs to get through, it is quite a concern how that would work. So we reviewed the criteria for prioritization and upgrading classification. Mostly it's based on vehicular volume count, and that's in terms of ADT. So a typical annual average daily traffic volume. And we have identified some candidate streets, and we'll get to that. That's on the circulation side. As a segue, we get into what we call curbside management, and that's where on-street parking comes in. And again, these are all related. They're related because curbside and circulation really come together in terms of friction. So where we have activity on the side of the road, along with through activity vehicles driving through, that's where we have the potential for friction. And that's most of what we actually see in Chester. So along with our traffic counts, we also carried out parking surveys. So we walked the streets and we counted the number of cars parked throughout the village. Not surprisingly, June and August, we see that in terms of parking inventory and utilization from 0 to 1. Obviously at 1, we have full parking utilization. So demand meets the inventory. The inventory of parking was measured, first of all, where they're actually striped parking spaces, particularly on Water Street at the Tankwood Ferry terminal. And then elsewhere is a calculation based on the length of the street block, accounting for driveways, accounting for proximity to the intersection. And then we calculated basically how many cars could fit in that along that block. Then we counted the actual number of cars that were parked there. And again, not surprisingly, we see both in June, particularly in race week, the highest demand, almost full utilization along the water. And that's where everybody wants to park. Net, however, there is parking capacity, on-street parking capacity in Chester. So same as with the vehicular volumes and road traffic, overall, there's not really a capacity issue. The main concern is that there are high levels of friction at specific places. So in terms of an on-street parking strategy, what we'll get to is trying to disperse this demand. For the most part, there are no parking restrictions really in most positions. There are a few spots in the core and down by the water, but otherwise, on-street parking is available and unregulated anywhere, and it's free. So naturally, people gravitate to the most attractive locations, the most accessible ones to their activity. So they gravitate to Water Street, Duke Street, Queen Street, down by the water, down by the yacht club. It's just naturally where they go. So out of that, then the strategy would be, how can we disperse this demand such that we don't have that high level of friction on some of these key routes, and that we don't obstruct circulation and bring and cause unsafe conditions. As with the traffic counts, we increased, or we factored up these demands by 30%, just to see what that post or pre-COVID effect would be. Again, not surprisingly, we go the next level over. So the core during race week could conceivably be fully utilized. Looking at our traffic counts, then of course across the course of the day. So we have our initial counts here in blue, was the June traffic count with 30%. Then with Chester, which race week plus 30%. So we see really a doubling of the number of cars on these roads. And that's where we, again, it just reinforces that that's the seasonal issue. It's a key event, and it's an unusual or atypical situation that we need to focus on and address kind of separately from the rest of the what we call the off-peak demand, which is reasonable in terms of number of cars on the streets. That takes us then also as well in terms of friction to the sidewalk cafe assessment. What we heard from our consultation and public engagement is that there's generally a good support for additional sidewalk cafes. Respondents felt that it's a nice feature. it animates the street. It's obviously businesses, particularly during conditions such as the pandemic, when there are restrictions to the number of patrons that may be accommodated inside. The key issue, though, is with the execution of these sidewalk cafes. Whereas in an ideal situation, we would have sort of a compensation of the sidewalk space and parking space lost with a facility that preserves and actually even improves accessibility around the cafe or around the business. The way this was implemented in Chester was not necessarily the most effective, particularly with regards to accessibility to mobility impaired users or to mobility devices. Whereas from the sidewalk, a user could just not cross over, cross down. The way this was executed was kind of after the ramp from the sidewalk. There was also an accessible parking space that was obstructed while the sign was still there. So some miscommunication issues there, and really on the execution that we might work. We noted that there are sidewalk cafe bylaws that have been produced both for such initiatives in HRM as well as in Wolfville. And we understood that municipality of Chester is also has a draft sidewalk cafe bylaw in the works. So we encourage creation of that bylaw. Typically, they outline what the design of the general criteria for the design of the sidewalk cafe, for the design of circulation facilities around the cafe, obviously maintaining accessible spaces, maintaining accessibility to the sidewalk. And that's examples of that. I'm sure you're well aware. So that takes us then into the next set of, we call them recommendations, but they're more options for your consideration, which investigated options for conversions of Big Loop Road, for Water Street, and for Fox Point Front Street. And in terms of that, the question posed to us, first of all, was, or the framework or the context was that these roads are generally narrow, and they currently do not allow for, not easily allow for the accommodation of active transportation facilities. On some sections, they are perceived as being unsafe. So one way of addressing these concerns would be to convert these roads to one-way, single lane, one-way for vehicular traffic, thereby allowing the reallocation of the rest of the road to some kind of AT facilities. So we investigated some of these options, and we thought through what the implications might be. And I'll take these in order. First of all, Big Loop Road. So Big Loop Road is somewhat windy road. There are some spots where there are visibility issues around the bend. There's topography involved as well, going uphill, turns. There's vegetation encroaching onto very close to the paved portion of the road. All of that leads to some feelings of the road being unsafe. It's also quite a nice sort of cut through or alternative entrance in and out of the access in and out of the village, into the Gulf, of course, as an alternative to Duke Street or coming from the west through the village. So in terms of then conversion to one way, so in conversion to one way, which way is it going to be? Is it clockwise or counterclockwise? And the advantages and disadvantages of both. In terms of the advantages, well, the vehicular circulation is reduced to one lane, so that allows us then to use the other lane for some kind of active transportation facility, either permanent or temporary. It reduces so there are no more really crossing traffic. The vehicular volumes are reduced roughly by half. And we can still maintain full access to the adjacent or the connecting streets and properties. So that's not an issue. The disadvantage really is the inconvenience of being able to drive only one way. So depending where one lives or is originating or destined along this road, one edge or the other, drive doing the full. Also, on the approach to Duke Street, topography there introduces we're going downhill into the village, uphill, out of the village, and particularly downhill. There is some conflict and particularly some visibility issues with drivers and pedestrians and actually all users of the road coming from North Point Road, where as we turn towards Duke Street, big loop comes from uphill. It's really a bit of a tight corner of vegetation there as well. So then if there is speeding down the hill, then there might be potential for conflict there. In terms of emergency vehicle access, when discussing these options with the fire department, well, ideally they would have access to at any point for both directions. Depending on where an incident might occur, they would just take the fastest road there. So in some cases, if they need to go in the opposite direction to access the site, they'll do it. Now, wherever the incident might occur, wherever an emergency vehicle might stop, that's where we might introduce or have a kind of a bottleneck or narrowing. So at that point, depending on the event, approaching traffic would have to turn around, back up, or ideally be directly ahead of that blockage. And that would require extra coordination with emergency services to achieve. In the opposite direction, counterclockwise in this case, again, same advantages. An advantage also is that we no longer have that conflict at North Point Road. Disadvantages really the same conditions apply, except that in wintertime, now we're going uphill only in one direction. So we have heard concerns over icy conditions on that stretch of road and being able to negotiate the road uphill. Another option is to not convert to one way, keep both sides or the road open to both directions. However, break the road somewhere in the middle. Chandler Road would be a good candidate, whereby you really don't have any through traffic on Big Loop Road. So both of these, or both segments of the road, essentially will become dead-end streets, ending into the respective roads. The advantage of that is that we maintain full bidirectional access to all properties. We can reach or access the area from in both directions. It reduces traffic. So that's a segment of, or a component of the traffic volumes, of vehicular volumes that are no longer on the road. So that reduces the potential for conflict on the road, thereby making it easier or safer for non-vehicular traffic. So it doesn't, as a disadvantage, it doesn't specifically allocate road space to formal active transportation facilities, but it reduces the speed volumes, first of all, that cause the feeling of, or the perception of unsafe conditions. Access to all properties and streets are maintained. Access to the golf course is still maintained, except that motorized or vehicular traffic would only be able to access the golf course from Highway 3, not some concern or some thoughts of concern might be that, well, you can still cut through the area via Millennium Drive. However, unless local know of it, sort of regional visitors would not know that. And also, once you do that, you really no longer have a cut through or shortcut. You're now going through a number of intersections, through a windy residential street, and you're really just better off sticking to Duke Street instead. So it's not really that significant of a concern that it would happen. What this option does require, however, is some specific treatment of where that road breaks down. And that's where we have a semi-permeable or permeable barrier of some kind. These are increasingly used in quite a lot of jurisdictions. They are quite clearly discourage or stop vehicular traffic going through. However, they are permeable to active transportation users, cyclists and pedestrians, as well as to emergency vehicles. And we'll get into how those treatments, how they may be done. Through mountable curbs or really flexible bollards, an emergency vehicle can very easily pass through, whereas a regular vehicle would not. Another option is to road as is, but address some of the most pressing concerns, particularly around the windier segments. So this might entail either selective widening at some spots, clearing the vegetation, or replacement of the adjacent sort of edge vegetation to something that's low growing and that's low maintenance over the years, such that the spots or the segments that are considered unsafe are improved and visibility is improved as well. This option, the disadvantage of that is that it does not really address the volumes through the area. There have been some concerns expressed that if you clean up the road or if you widen it, it would actually encourage speeding. That's not necessarily the case. It's not really something that we would see. We would see speeding on a straight, flat stretch of road, not so much on the windy part. So this would be sort of the easiest thing to do. Would not require very significant treatment or changes to the area. However, it might require some detailed design consideration in some parts where widening may be considered, and that's because of some of the ditches and just sort of the grading on both sides of the road. In any case, the right of way is quite wide, so there's room to do some of these interventions without having any property impacts. Moving on then to Water Street. So really the main difficulty or concern with Water Street is just the high level of friction that we have on this road, primarily on account of it being a focal destination. The rope loft is there, a lot of the docks are there, the Tankook ferry terminal is there as well. The parking lot associated or used by Tankook ferry users in the south. So there's parking on the street. There's sidewalk on the southern portion of it from Duke Street to the rope loft. So that there is a lot of friction there. So in terms of options there for converting to one street or for reallocating road space in various ways, if that were to be done, then we'd be looking at a counterclockwise loop only, on account of the boat launch being located just to the north of the Tankook ferry terminal, which would require that vehicles back in their boats down the launch. So that really restricts the kind of conversion to the one direction only. What may be done with such a conversion is that since we are freeing up some of the road space, we can move it around a little bit. So if there's what we notice in the south, parking is on the land side and active transportation facilities on the water side. All right. So how about we extend that and keep that going? So whereas north of the rope loft, parking is on the water side, we would move it on the west side, on the land side, and perhaps extend an active transportation path or multi-use path of some kind on the water side. Now, what this does is it it simplifies a little bit the circulation and the wayfinding through this area. This loop, what it would do in terms of circulation in and out of the core would be that most visitors or inbound traffic would come down Duke Street, down into the core and then exit via Water Street. From a circulation standpoint and capacity standpoint, that would be fine. Again, the road capacity is there, and you really would not expect any kind of capacity constraints at these intersections, all of which are stop controlled. So it would not really be an issue. By extending the active transportation facility on the one side, then it continues that loop up to Duke Street. It reduces friction on the actual road, and at which point that friction will only exist between the on-street parking and the through sort of driving lane. One concern there is that some of the private properties have a water lot, and they do have provisions to maintain access to their docks. Whereas the way we see that now is that such owners park their vehicle right by the access to their private dock, and that may need to be addressed on a case basis to see whether those owners, first of all, are receptive to parking on the land side as opposed to the water side. And if not, then there might be some design opportunities to accommodate such parking still, whereby sort of the road becomes kind of a mixed use. Still park temporarily, however, by the dock, but we can still accommodate formal or semi-formal active transportation facilities around that. Now, we do note that the Tankook Island Ferry will, so in a few years now, that will no longer be in Chester. So that will free up this area, the ferry dock itself, and then the parking lot associated with it. So that's a lot of parking, about 35, I believe, sorry, a dozen or so, that's currently used by Tankook Island ferry users. Those spots will now become open to general use. So that would also sort of free up and allow a different kind of activity pattern there. Moving on then to Fox Point Front Road, similar considerations to Big Loop. First of all, in what direction we might do this conversion. The concern here, or the interest, is that on the water side, ideally on the water side, there be provision for some active transportation facility of some kind, as well as perhaps for shoreline protection features. And to do that in a really narrow right-of-way, right on the edge of the shore, again, would require that there be some kind of space reallocation, of road space reallocation. So looking at it, first of all, in one way or another, again, the advantage is that we reduce vehicular volumes, again, roughly by half. That allows for the reallocation of road space to an active transportation facility. The disadvantage is really on the inconvenience. And the consideration then is there is some concern on speeding as well. With less friction, people are more comfortable with speeding. And then on which direction this would be done. So depending on which direction, really the outbound or the inbound, we're a bit partial to having the outbound movement maintained, but it's really a consideration by the municipality. The other option is, as with Pig Loop, that we maintain two-way access to the front road. However, that we close off or have a permeable barrier down at Highway 329. Again, similar to Pig Loop Road, this would require some treatment at this intersection. Again, a permeable treatment, as well as signage, good signage at the Highway 3 intersection, such that regional traffic not enter the road if they're actually destined to the 329. And that might be either a dead end sign or a clear sign saying that there is no access to the 329. Now at the very end, we show that as kind of a roundabout, a cul-de-sac. It need not be that wide. Ideally, there would be some space to turn around. But if the only real users on the road are locals, then they use their drivers anyway. So there would be no need for that. And again, that barrier would be fully accessible, fully permeable to emergency vehicles. In terms of what these barriers look like, again, there are a wide number of treatments available in the literature as well as through TAC standards, be it rolled curbs or vegetated medians or just even temporary barriers. And I'll get to that towards the end of my presentation. But for all of these streets, these treatments need not be permanent for the whole year. They can be just seasonal, and they can address really only the peak season where these issues occur. So through everything we've investigated in the study, really any measures brought to bear could be seasonal and they could be temporary. And at that point, design features that may restrict access or convert roads to one-way or to one-way operation can be temporary. It can be planters, it can be flexible boulders or removable boulders. They can be removable curbs as well. What that would do is, first of all, address the need when it's most apparent, which is during the peak summer season. And it would also then exclude the requirements or have no impact on winter snow clearance because the facility just would not be there. What this would require is that there'd be good information disseminated to the community that these interventions are in place during the set summer months or any kind of peak month. And here we have the experience in our experience, the town of St. Andrews, New Brunswick, where a few years ago we undertook, we produced a transportation master plan for the town. One of the recommendations or one of the things we had looked at were one-way conversions, particularly on their main commercial street, where there was a lot of friction between road traffic as the main avenue, main access into the town, as well as where most of the activity occurs. So businesses on both sides, a lot of on-street parking, access to the dock, access to City Hall, to the post office, to the banks, as well as delivery trucks. So a lot of friction on that road. What was tried first of all, on a temporary pilot project kind of basis was conversion of that street to one-way through the installation of planters, mobile planters and signage. It worked well the first summer when they tried it. It worked well when they had they used extra road space or the freed up road space for a temporary sort of cycling lane during the summer. And then they've kept it through, I believe, since. And since then, every summer, the actual barrier that's put in place they've invested in it, and now it's more aesthetic features. There's good signage to indicate when the road is one way from what date to what date, and it seems to work quite well. So again, these changes to the road network, to circulation, can be seasonal. Again, examples of permeable barriers. A lot of jurisdictions have them, including Montreal, Halifax here. This is in my neighborhood. So these are quite permeable, and emergency vehicles can drive sometimes around them or just over them. These are flexible boulders, and they're plastic or rubber, so no damage to the vehicles themselves. Every once in a while, you might get an unfortunate car that at first may drive through. It doesn't happen often. It will learn quickly, and again, signage takes care of that. an advantage of this treatment, not just on the roads we've discussed for conversion, but elsewhere through the village, is that it can be a very good traffic control measure, and particularly for temporary traffic control. In St. Andrews, we recommended that they be implemented over a sort of traffic control zone in the town to be used during really the peak events. In that case, it's in really July and around the Canada Day festivities and Canada Day weekend, where there's a very, very significant influx of tourists and sort of regional travel to the town. And that's where when they need to control and manage all of this on-street parking that otherwise ends up clogging up all the town's streets in unsafe ways. So this can be done again through removable bollards, through flexible bollards, through planters, and it can be quite effective. In terms of the transportation facilities, particularly for Fox Point Road, again, they can be temporary. They can be ideally bi-directional and separate from the roadway. If they're permanent, then they'll be protected by a clear curb. If they are permanent, then it requires some kind of understanding and agreement with Department of Public Works, particularly whereby, as we understood it, Public Works would not be responsible for clearing such facility. That would be on the municipalities' responsibilities, as well as the construction of this the multi-path. So that's where the advantage of having it as a seasonal facility comes into play, with having less long-term cost and maintenance requirements. Now for Water Street, we had the potential for conversion of Water Street to parking on the land side, and then an active use, active transport facility of some kind on the water side. This is a quick diagrammatic representation. There are examples of this elsewhere, and that's where the road itself might be converted to a shared street format, whereby we're no longer talking necessarily of rigid allocation of space for the curb, sidewalk, and the striping, but where the whole treatment of the road is a bit more fluid. So that might be one aspect or one option to look at, where if, particularly during the summer months, if we manage to sort of disperse parking demand, and perhaps even if the municipality chooses to identify Water Street as a traffic calmed area, then this kind of thing will move there, where through the various treatments, it's really the active transportation component that becomes predominant, and that is encouraged. So that's something that may be looked at either for Water Street or other streets. I note again the policy for traffic calming and conversions of one-way streets. There is no real policy now regarding this. So where it's proposed by a municipality, a traffic study is again called by or required by the department, review of traffic volumes, network impacts and such. And in our case, given the volumes we've seen, there would be no real significant intersection impacts anywhere. It's where signage would be a bit more of a focus point to ensure that there's adequate signage. Maintenance of all of these ready. Pilot projects. So with these one-way conversions or with the introduction of barriers or introduction of any kind of traffic calming measures, they can be temporary, they can be seasonal, and they can be tested out through pilot projects. And Public Works is quite receptive to this idea, either through sort of pop-up projects where sometimes over the course of a day or a weekend, things are put in place. they're tried out as part of an event particularly, and that's where Chester Race Week might be something to consider, where the space can be treated differently for a short amount of time for a particular event. Test it out, feedback can be collected from the community, and then that project can be extended over a longer period and semi-formalized through a pilot project. And only then, if it's considered to work well and it's liked and approved by stakeholders and the community, then it can be a recurring event. Pilot projects, discuss that. Also, as part of circulation and improving circulation, and partly connected to the one-way road conversions, we were asked to look at to investigate the potential of improving the Duke Street Valley Road and Pig Loop intersection, particularly as there is a need to situate a new generator really on the right of way next to, I believe that's what's there now, is a sewer pump station. Our capacity, so not capacity, space constraints on that right of way. Our sort of the generator cannot be placed on the private property, so there might be an opportunity to simplify that intersection a little bit. First of all, by removing the slip lane, putting that splitter there, and just formalizing the road a little bit. That would require removal of, there's a crosswalk on the north side of the intersection that's not really maintained very well. It crosses to no receiving facility on the east side. But there could be a new crosswalk across Valley Road, connecting then into what is a crosswalk there now, recently implemented down at the Water Street and Duke Street intersection. This reconfiguration can work both with the current situation with Water Street and Duke Street two-way, or with the potential reconfiguration to one-way of that loop. So that would then convert this access into inbound via Duke Street, outbound via Water Street, and of course the ability to turn between the two. We looked at the potential to sort of either close off Valley Road or tie it in a different way, but that would probably not see too much support in the community. So it can be kept currently as is. The volumes on Valley Road are not all that significant, and the intersection can work still well. We show it. On the traffic calming recommendations, as I noted, one of the next steps would be to carry out a speed survey of the village streets, particularly the north-south. And once we have some confirmation that there is speeding, and these are the 85th percentile speeds, that there is speeding on those roads, that's where Public Works would be more receptive to the implementation or the installation of some kind of traffic control facilities. Moving on to a result of all we looked at for road prioritization, it might be an opportunity to adopt or bring into play a road classification system that upgrades Duke Street, Pleasant Street, South Street, and Central Street to level 2, particularly as they are the major or the main access points to Highway 3, and they are really clear for and critical emergency access roads. The volume and the traffic volume analysis we undertook also suggests that these roads would meet the sort of the threshold point of 1,500 vehicles per day. That would then bring them up to a level 2. Now, during I think the last snowstorm, one of the last snowstorms, the village was faced with an emergency event that then required snow clearance And as we understood it, Public Works would only dispatch snow clearance if there was actual 911 event. So that's kind of doing things the wrong way. So that's where, particularly Central Street, it might be a case to register as a priority road for snow clearance, particularly as an emergency route. Moving on, and lastly into the on-street parking. So one of the requirements of the study was that we develop an on-street parking plan. Through our analysis, we showed that overall, the village has sufficient on-street parking space or space on the road to accommodate on-street parking. The issue is just that the parking demand is not adequately dispersed. And that's just by virtue of there being very limited parking restriction or parking enforcement. And during race week, especially, everybody up to congregates and centers in on the water, on the shoreline. So those streets then become so that's where the strategy is to look at next. And this would, again, it can be on a seasonal basis, not necessarily during the whole year. First of all, is that an area to be defined as having sort of priority for or managed controlled on-street parking. It may be paid parking, or they may be just sort of time restrictions, ideally no more than 2 hours in the core. What we want with parking is that turnover and fast turnover is assured. So if we have parking and on-street parking and people just leave the car there all day, it doesn't really help. What we want is that patrons come, use the services, use the facilities, enjoy the village, and then move so others can do it as well. So we want a time limit on the on-street parking. If it's not paid, so paid parking through any number of devices or measures is a good way of doing that. Otherwise, enforcement is key. Really, it's on-street parking that require the bylaw enforcers sort of do regular rounds in the village and ticket. So pay system, locating then, so there's parking restriction or parking control in some areas, and then allowing parking or directing parking elsewhere. And portions of Central Street are interesting in that respect, just because of the width of the right of way, and the width of the road itself. So there would be space for on-street parking there. Well, I get to that goes hand in hand then with implementing potentially a temporary or seasonal parking strategy when it's most needed during seasonal events, whereby the municipality installs parking restriction signs in key areas and directs parking to, well, first of all, off-street parking where available. So we have the Memorial Arena, we have the school, and the Tancook visitor parking lot, which again in the next few years will be vacated by Tancook ferry users. So between those, there's an opportunity to then direct parking, these key seasonal user parking to these places. What that then would require, or that would go hand in hand, is with some kind of bus shuttle service or van service of some kind. We understand that has been tried in the past. It just has not worked very well, given that there was no parking plan to go with it. So while the shuttle service was available, it was not used because most people still chose to park down by the water or wherever they could, as close to it as possible. So the next step in such a plan, such a strategy, would be to identify key road segments where parking is either restricted or reserved. During race week, for example, it might be reserved to yacht club, yacht club staff, or to some of the visitors, potentially acceptable parking spaces. be strongly enforced. At the same time, it might be implemented on these key emergency routes to keep them clear, such that in event of an emergency vehicles are not blocked by on-street parking. And that's where then parking would be dispersed elsewhere. A communication plan needs to be prepared as well and be visible and disseminated during race week or say the whole summer season, directing visitors to specific areas and keeping them away from some of these more critical spots. The Sidewalk Cafe initiative I mentioned, I'm glad to hear that there's a draft bylaw, and I encourage the municipality to complete it. And that takes me to the end.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yeah, you covered it in great detail, and you looked at almost every possible scenario, so it gives us a lot to think about for sure. Does anyone have any questions? Do you? Yes.
Where do we go from here? Because you were clear with some things in this report that are excellent, some that are a no-go. And even consider some of those big proposals for just won't work.
Yeah.
But that last point hill, trucks can't make that left turn. It just won't happen. So we need to go through, take some things off the table and talk about what's possible.
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure, and I'm not sure that we're prepared to do it today. I don't know if it's
No,
another
I just
event.
don't know what the next step is.
Yeah, I know that obviously we don't own any of the streets, so that doesn't help. So I think that and before we had the discussion with highways about what the possible options might be, we wanted to have this information. So I
think maybe what we could do is, so you've received the presentation. The next step might be staff thinking about putting together some recommendations, maybe in priority order, but we would need to get some feedback from council members, to your point about options that you think would not be suitable.
Just won't work. No matter
It just
what.
won't work.
You just, cars will be going into the ocean.
Yeah.
Down that turn left into Don's
Yeah.
Point. I mean, that's downright dangerous. Just can't have it. So I mean.
we know we have an issue that we've been waiting for this report for concerning that pumping station.
This is a good report. I like it. There's a lot of good things.
So now that we have the discussion with highways, I mean, I don't want to make it simple because it's not, nothing is. But I mean, whether we had one-way streets and whether we restricted parking, and those were the, some of the big issues. So out of this, there are some recommendations concerning that.
And there's a couple of the areas, Pig Loop, Fox Point Front Road, that are also linked into our active transportation and our application that we have in to improve active transportation facilities in those areas. So I think there are probably some areas where there would be some recommended actions for council to consider. Gord or Chad, do you have advice in terms of, I'm not sure it's a full-blown request for decision where we would provide very specific recommendations?
Yeah, that's certainly not the intention today, Dan.
Yeah.
So just a reminder, particularly Pig Loop comes to mind, Fox Point Front comes to mind for me, that the intention of this study was to help inform the options and to figure out your preferences, keeping in mind that those are considered under our CIP proposal. All of these still require some sort of engineering to finalize the design, so nothing is complete. That was not the task for CBCL here.
No.
They've done a fantastic job of presenting all these options. But the other theme that emerges through this report for me is seasonal problems, seasonal solutions.
Right.
And that was made clear by Emmanuel early in the process too. So I think about what are some of our opportunities. Race week is an obvious one. The Howard Sailing races is also an obvious one as well. So can we get our act together in time with going through, deeper dive into your preferences, where are the no-goes? But where are some of those opportunities that we could capitalize on sooner than later at a reasonable cost, kind of the fail small kind of principle as well, where let's just try some stuff out, see how it goes, without making major investments. But also knowing that we have the funding available to us, we think, to make the longer term investments when we're ready to do that too.
There may be additional options. I like the option. I like that all. I didn't agree with them all, but that's not what the idea was. The idea was to put the options in. I get that. But the option of, for example, making people partially one way, two-way from Highway 3 to the golf course, two-way, and then from Butte to Knox Point, two-way, and the rest one way is something. Don't know if that's feasible, but that could be an option. That might be looked at. So I think, I read it last night. I got a lot more out of it listening to it today. And now I want to go back and reread it. There's some good stuff in there. I like it. But we live those streets every day, so we know some of the other maybe issues that we run into.
So what do we want to do?
Councilor Connors.
Oh, sorry, Team.
Oh, that's okay. So first off, thank you. I really appreciated the presentation, and like Derek, I'm going to go back and reread the report as well. I'll probably go back and listen to the YouTube presentation again. One thing, I do have a question. In terms of the report, I'm very much interested in the stakeholder engagement. Appendix A is not there, so all of the information in Appendix A, I'm wondering if we can receive.
Yes, of course.
Okay, thank you.
We have a reheard report that goes along with in the appendix. I apologize, that was not included in our.
It's okay. That's okay. And again, I really did appreciate the words that you used in the presentation around the province would really like confirmation that speeding is a concern, right? We do need to confirm that because we have speeders everywhere, towns, rural areas, everywhere. So what is the concern? Let's define that concern. I like the idea of your reference to parking. Again, is it a concern? Is it seasonal? Is it, and you use the word friction? Is it, and I can end that sentence the way I want it. Like, is it friction between visitors, residents, the business owners? Like who's tying up those spaces, I guess. I like the idea of looking at directing parking elsewhere. And part of that for me is in the downtown, are the business owners and the employees of the businesses, because I don't know, are they using those spots or are they parking not in the downtown? I know 100 years ago with the town of Lunenburg, I was involved with a project there and they were looking at the same because they were concerned with who was using those spaces. So they did look to some fellow towns and areas where they could learn some examples of how to softly encourage maybe employees to not tie up the downtown parking spots. Also too, I'm very intrigued with the idea of prioritizing the roads in the village for winter attention or for snow removal. So I'm very intrigued on that discussion. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I got one more point. And on page 23, they talk about traffic calming plan. I thought that was brilliant. I like that. I love the idea of reduced speed limits. I was told we couldn't do it.
Well,
So I'd like to have more discussion on that because it's ridiculous that we can't reduce some of these speed limits.
well, that's a discussion we have to.
I know, but it's in here. I'm glad it's in here. I want to know how we can do it. So I'm really intrigued with that traffic calming plan. It's not really, I like to word it, I like the way it's worded too. It's traffic calming. Yeah, as opposed to road rage.
Just two other things. Go ahead, Emmanuel, sorry.
I'll just quickly interject on that on the traffic calming. So the intent there is that through some kind of design interventions on the road that would naturally restrict road users' speed. So it would reduce the propensity to speed, because otherwise just putting a speed limit, now it's 30, they may or may not follow that. So unless then you have ongoing enforcement where you have the
Design change.
speed limit.
Yeah.
Derek, just for clarity, the expectation is that Department of Public Works will have that traffic calming plan available to municipalities.
Yes. I was talking about
It's
the
not
rain
complete
anyway.
yet. It's been in development for a while, but the expectation, I think, is that they'll present a menu of options to municipalities and kind of pick the one that works most contextually in your situation.
No, it's good.
Sam,
I just have one comment for Emmanuel. It's a good report, but one thing I think is understated in your report is the impact of the Tanko Ferry. It's not just the parking lot on Valley Road, that's insignificant. There's a lot of parking permanently down the waterfront. Today, in the middle of winter, it's full of parked cars. On weekends, all through the year, people going to Tanko for the day or for the weekend, parking. All through the village, there's dozens and dozens of cars parked in private parking lots, all through the village.
Right.
And all of that will go away, for like, it'll all go away. So I think it's been a huge impact on the availability of parking. So I'm just thinking of on a go forward basis for next year, the year after, whenever it happens. You have to keep that in mind.
One thing we'll do there would be to revisit this when that happens, just to get a sense. So do another one of these on-street parking survey. Once the Tank Ferry is gone, then what is that demand? How much is actually parked on the street?
Yeah, we did ask Emmanuel to quantify that. So he's got 20 to 30 parking spots in Water Street is the current inventory, but that will change absolutely. So the usage will change.
That's right.
okay, so I think we all need to go home and give it a little more thought, but I also think that staff, there's some things that for this summer, like you're saying, the race week and things like that.
Some priorities.
That give us some options on how to deal with that, because I mean, those issues are coming, you know. Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, everyone.
We're taking a 5-minute break, people.